Listen closely and you can hear the problem before you even see it. The music kicks in, the frame speeds up, bodies begin sprinting in circles. Benny Hill turns panic into rhythm, and for a few seconds, the whole machine through the world around it has changed. That is what happened to the Benny Hill Show. There was no single scandal that suddenly tore it off the air. No one sketch that made Britain slam the brakes. What ended it, in spirit, was a scene that looked comfortingly familiar. The final, full-blooded yakety sax chase. The old signature played one more time as if repetition alone could still count as vitality. It was funny, frantic, expertly timed, and completely revealing. In that moment, the show was no longer reinventing its formula. It was trapped inside it. This is the scene that ended the Benny Hill Show forever. To understand why that closing rhythm became so fatal, you have to understand what Benny Hill had once been. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, born in Southampton in 1924, came out of a world shaped by music hall, variety turns, radio timing, and old-fashioned visual clowning. He took the stage name Benny in tribute to Jack Benny, and slowly found that television, more than theater, was the place where his gifts exploded. He could write patter songs, play fools, lechers, authority figures, and idiots, slip into parody, and then let camera tricks do the rest. He was one of the first British comedians to discover that television was not just a stage with a lens pointed at it, it was a toy box. Speed up, cutaways, visual cheats, rhythmic editing, and silent reaction shots could all become part of the punchline. The Benny Hill Show began on the BBC in 1955, later shifted through ITV and ATV, and finally found its most famous long-running form at Thames Television from 1969 until its cancellation in 1989. At its peak, it pulled more than 21 million viewers in Britain, won Hill a BAFTA for Best Writer, earned Emmy nominations in the United States, and was exported around the world, with its visual humor crossing language barriers more easily than many prestige comedies ever could. That success was not an accident. Hill understood something many smarter comedians forget. Laughter often lands hardest when it can be grasped instantly. A glance, a slap, a double take, a trouser catastrophe, a pompous official punctured in half a second. He was not merely a dirty joke merchant, though he could certainly be one. He was a craftsman of movement, his sketches borrowed from music hall, silent comedy, radio nonsense, parody, burlesque, and live review, then compressed all of it into television form. The show could swing from a mock costume drama to a football parody, then to a song, then to a wordless piece of physical idiocy. The women, the uniforms, the chase scenes, the cheeky innuendo, all of that became the public shorthand, but it was only part of the engine. Hill was also a mimic, a structural comic, and an editor's comedian. He knew how long a stare should last. He knew when to cut away. He knew when silliness needed acceleration. Recent reassessments have made exactly this point, arguing that he was not just a saucy relic, but a clown working in a visual tradition closer to Keaton, Chaplin, and Lloyd than his critics like to admit. The cast around him mattered as much as the star. Jackie Wright, with that unforgettable bald head and wounded dignity, became an icon of the show's slapstick language. Henry McGee gave the sketches a polished foil, somebody who looked like he belonged in respectable television even as the program kept yanking him into absurdity. Bob Todd brought a bulldozing comic presence. The Ladybirds supplied musical backing and occasional appearances. Then there were the dancers and featured women, who later became known collectively as Hill's Angels, especially in the 1980s, when the show leaned harder into glamour and visual fantasy. Benny Hill could only work if the world around him looked straight enough to break. His comedy needed structure to misbehave against. Wright, McGee, Todd, and the recurring ensemble gave him that structure. This is also where the nostalgia comes from. For older audiences, the Benny Hill show does not survive in memory because every sketch was perfect. It survives because it belonged to an era when television variety still felt like an event, and when broad comedy did not apologize for wanting to be broad. The show's huge peak audience in the early 70s tells you how deeply it had entered British popular life. By the late 70s and early 80s, the Thames version was also becoming a major export, especially in America, where edited syndication packages turned Benny Hill into a global symbol of British undercrank chases, yakety sax, policemen, vicars, old ladies, pretty women, and Benny grinning in the middle of the mess. The theme became so culturally fused to the show that ITV viewers later voted it their favorite network theme tune. There is also a behind-the-scenes reason the show lasted as long as it did. The Thames years were shaped not only by Hill's writing and performance, but by director-producer Dennis Kirkland, whose work became central to the polished specials many viewers now think of as the mature Benny Hill format. That mattered because the Benny Hill show was never just a man telling jokes, it was a choreography of tones. One minute you had a parody of a police drama, the next a mock period piece, the next a musical number, then a piece of near-silent slapstick. If the directing had been lazy, the whole thing would have felt like disconnected nonsense. Instead, in its strongest stretch, it felt like a comic review, guided by somebody who knew exactly when to accelerate and when to hold on a reaction. The result was a product polished enough for international syndication and loose enough to still feel mischievous. That international success changed the series in subtle ways. In Britain, Benny Hill was part of a homegrown tradition people already recognized. Saucy postcards, variety stages, pub humor, seaside innuendo, and comic humiliation. In America, especially once the edited half-hour syndication package took off in the late 70s, he became something else. An instantly exportable image of British comedy that required almost no translation. Viewers did not need to follow every spoken joke. They only had to understand movement, embarrassment, authority figures getting punctured, and a man being reduced to an idiot by his own impulses. That is a powerful kind of fame, but it comes with a price. The simpler the export image becomes, the more the artist risks being flattened by it. A broad clown can become trapped inside the broadest version of himself. Benny Hill, who had range, character work, and structural imagination, gradually became known to millions as the man from the chase scene. Once that reduction takes hold, it begins to feed the material back into itself. The show starts serving the icon instead of the artist. You can feel that flattening if you compare the aura of the early Thames years with the late ones. Earlier on, even when the humor was crude, there was a sense of play. The show looked like it was discovering itself as it went. By the 80s, some of that looseness had been replaced by a more polished but narrower formula. The women became more central, as spectacle. The Hill's Angels era made the glamour component impossible to ignore. The pace remained professional, the craft remained visible. But craft alone is not enough for longevity. You need surprise. You need the sense that a veteran performer still has new angles. Once the audience starts predicting the direction of the joke before it turns, the smile changes. It becomes recognition instead of laughter. For a while, Benny Hill could survive on recognition because the goodwill bank was enormous. Yet, television history is merciless, with formats that stop renewing themselves. The same signatures that once create love can later create fatigue. And that is exactly what makes the late Benny Hill story so sad. He did not forget how to be Benny Hill. He simply reached the point where being Benny Hill in the old way no longer felt sufficient. But popularity is not the same thing as immunity. The very qualities that make a show iconic can become the bars of its cage. Hill's style belonged to a television culture shaped by post-war variety and by a national appetite for seaside postcard chic, broad double entendre, and unapologetic male foolishness. In that framework, Benny was not usually a conquering predator. He was more often the ridiculous man humiliating himself in pursuit of glamour, status, or sex. Hill defended the show by arguing that the women kept their dignity while the men were the buffoons. There is some truth in that. A lot of the male energy on the show is pathetic rather than triumphant. But by the 1980s, that defense was no longer enough to protect him. A younger generation of comedians and critics was changing the moral weather. Alternative comedy arrived with a harsher eye for sexism, racism, lazy stereotypes, and old light entertainment habits. Ben Elton's notorious attacks on Hill in 1987 did not single-handedly destroy the program, but they captured the new mood with painful clarity. Hill's comedy, Elton argued, belonged to a culture that was no longer harmless. Academic reassessments since then have been more balanced, but even sympathetic scholars note that Hill intensified the objectification angle in the 1980s, and that this harmed both the comedy and his career. That changing climate alone would not have ended the show if the material had still been evolving. But this is where the decline becomes visible. When the Benny Hill show was fresh, the women were not the whole joke. The chase was not the whole joke, and the smirk was not the whole joke. They were ingredients inside a much larger comic system. As time went on, public memory of Benny Hill shrank toward a single image, a dirty old man in fast motion chasing women to yakety sax. That was never the entirety of what he did, but the show increasingly behaved as if the caricature were enough. The rhythms grew more predictable, the sexiness became less impish and more mechanical. The repeatable house style began to harden into self-imitation. Comedy can survive offense more easily than it can survive exhaustion. Hill was not only battling a new moral era, he was also battling the deadliest enemy of any variety format: recognizability without surprise. Scheduling added pressure. Thames no longer treated the program as a weekly national ritual, but as expensive one-hour specials. That format can make a comedian seem grander, but it can also expose repetition faster. A weekly sketch show can hide familiarity through habit. An occasional event has to justify its own return. By the late 80s, Benny's returns looked less like reinvention and more like ritual. That is why the scene I keep coming back to is not some notorious one-liner or one now-forgotten sketch. It is the final full-speed chase language of the last Thames era. The last time the show leaned on its oldest punctuation mark, as if it could still say something new. By then, the runoff was no longer just a finale, it was the brand. It was the thing audiences expected, the thing imitators copied, the thing critics mocked, and the thing executives could point to when they said the program had become repetitive. In its best years, the chase felt like comic release. After all the disguises, innuendo, confusion, and collapsing authority, the show would finally stop pretending to behave and just run. Bodies became percussion, editing became music, television itself became slapstick. But in the last phase, that same device started to feel like a reflex. You could sense the program reaching for a memory of itself. So let us stay with that main scene for a moment. Not the whole video, just the crucial heartbeat. Imagine watching one of the final Thames shows in 1989. The familiar mechanics begin to click into place. The cast assemble, the camera quickens, the tune charges in, and there it is, the chase. On paper, nothing has changed. Benny is still Benny. The women are still glamorous. The supporting players still know exactly how to hit the rhythm. The editing still understands acceleration. And yet the sequence lands differently because the surrounding culture has moved, the comic marketplace has moved, and the show itself has not moved enough with them. What once felt anarchic now feels dutiful. What once felt like payoff now feels like obligation. The moment is not offensive because it is unusually rude. It is devastating because it is too familiar. It turns the whole series into a self-parody in under a minute. The final chase says, without meaning to, that the show can only imagine ending one way, even when that ending has stopped carrying the same electricity. That is why this scene matters. It condenses the larger fall into one image, Benny Hill running inside his own legend while the legend empties out around him. The series did not die because it had a chase. It died because by the end, the chase had become the safest, laziest answer to the question of what the Benny Hill Show was. And once any comedy starts answering itself that mechanically, cancellation is only a matter of timing. The industrial context made that timing brutal. Thames Television canceled the program in 1989, with company executives citing falling audiences, heavy costs, and the sense that Hill himself looked tired. The show was reportedly costing around £450,000 per special by then. That was a serious number for a variety program whose once enormous ratings were declining, even if the last Thames edition still drew 9.58 million viewers. And the series remained one of Britain's most successful exports. John Howard Davies, the executive associated with the decision, later said the show was past its sell-by date. That phrase sounds cruel, but it also reveals the logic. Benny Hill was no longer being judged as a national institution. He was being judged as inventory. And here is the tragedy. The cancellation was not purely a moral verdict. People often retell the Benny Hill story as if political correctness alone marched into a television office and strangled him. That is too simple, and it lets the show off too easily. The truth is more interesting and sadder. Public taste had shifted. Alternative comedy had changed what sophistication looked like. Critics increasingly found Hill old-fashioned or sexist. Costs were high, ratings were down from their peak. But the program also helped create its own vulnerability by narrowing itself into the very image its enemies found easiest to attack. When a long-running comedy loses innovator, a comedian who understood television as movement and montage. Yet, by the late 80s, the most famous parts of his style had hardened into museum pieces he was still forced to animate. That is what the final chase represents. Not vulgarity, not sin. Stagnation. A show that once used camera speed to feel inventive was now using camera speed to hide fatigue. The cancellation hit Benny Hill hard. Accounts of his final years consistently describe a man wounded by the loss, physically declining, and emotionally adrift after being removed from the institution he had served for decades. In 1991, he began work on a new format, Benny Hill's World Tour, and managed to complete only one special, set in New York, before his health worsened. In 1992, Thames, having received steady requests for repeats, returned some re-edited Benny Hill material to the schedule. On the same day Hill died in April 1992, a new contract from Central Independent Television arrived in the post, offering him a path back to television. It is one of those details so unbearably neat that it feels written by a cruel screenwriter. The supporting cast carried the afterglow of the show in different ways. Henry McGee lived until 2024 and remained to the end, one of the faces people most strongly associated with Hill's golden years. Jackie Wright had already retired from the show before the final cancellation because of health problems and later died in 1989, the very year Thames pulled the plug. Bob Todd continued acting through television and film before his death in 1992. Sue Upton, one of the most visible of Hill's angels, has spent years defending both the man and the complexity of the show's legacy. The cast did not sync with the series in one theatrical collapse. They simply became part of a vanished television language. And that language is what makes the Benny Hill Show worth discussing seriously instead of just smirking at. It is easy to reduce Hill to a GIF before GIFs existed. A chase, a wig, a leer, a saxophone, but that reduction misses both why he became huge and why he became vulnerable. Benny Hill was a bridge between old British variety and global television modernity. He took local rhythms and made them exportable. He turned visual comedy into international currency. He could be crude, yes, and sometimes lazily so. He could lean too hard on the male gaze. He could repeat himself. But he was not a simple man doing a simple act. He was a form maker. And forms die when they stop discovering new uses for themselves. That is the broader story of the show. Not one scandal, not one activist, not one executive. A rise built on invention, a middle sustained by mastery, and a decline accelerated by repetition, cultural change, and the fatal confusion between iconography and vitality. The Benny Hill Show once felt dangerous in a playful way because it was never standing still. It was always switching costumes, targets, tempos, and points of view. By the end, the icon had overtaken the artist. Benny Hill was expected to provide Benny Hill on command, and eventually that request became impossible to satisfy without looking like a copy of an older original. That is why nostalgia for the program is always mixed. Older viewers remember genuine laughter, not just embarrassment. They remember family rooms, late-night repeats, and the thrill of comedy that felt a little forbidden without being truly vicious. They remember the speed, the absurdity, the songs, the little visual miracles. But even many admirers can see that the late phase lost some of the lightness that had once protected it. When the show stopped feeling inventive, the criticisms did more damage because there was less fresh artistry left to offset them. So when I say the scene that ended the Benny Hill Show forever was that final familiar chase, I do not mean one exact second switched the lights off at Thames. I mean that the closing runoff became the clearest symbol of what had happened to the series as a whole. It had become too easy to summarize, too easy to imitate, too easy to dismiss. The form that once made Hill universal had become the frame that trapped him. You can watch that last burst of speed and hear the applause of the past still echoing through it, but you can also hear the emptiness. The chase is still moving. The culture is already elsewhere. And that is what makes the ending sadder than a scandal would have been. A scandal, at least, feels alive. It means a show still has the power to shock. The Benny Hill show did not end because it shocked too much. It ended because it stopped surprising enough. It kept reaching for the same release, the same grin, the same sprint, the same tune, and trusted memory to do the rest. Memory can keep a legend alive, but it cannot keep a weekly format fresh. Benny Hill once understood that better than almost anyone. In the end, his own most famous device proved the thing he could no longer outrun. That is the real meaning of the final chase. Not a punchline, a confession. The show still knew how to run, it just no longer knew where to run next, to.